Welcome back to part 2 of the Robin analysis series, where we look at the Water 7 arc from the manga. Last thing I talked about in the previous part was when Robin is taken away by the masked figure and Chopper doesn't know where she went. Something else I'll address, which I've done before in other arcs or parts, is that with all the other events going on in the story, I'll be doing my best to focus strictly things with Robin or mentionings of her. I'll try my best to not have a play-by-play of the arc as a whole, but more focusing on Robin in particular. So for examples, the conflict with Luffy and Usopp, and about the ship and the other people in Water 7. I'll be doing my best to only briefly mention it when it's necessary. So with all that out of the way, let's continue onwards. We cut back to Sanji, who is daydreaming about going on a date with Nami and Robin. After he gets some cabbages from a fruit stand, he realizes that he's lost and found another dead end. He grumbles about the fact that he's acting like Zoro, who gets often lost, as he turns his head and sees Robin. He runs to her and turns the corner to find out that she's gone, and he doesn't know where she went to or how she disappeared. Besides the fact that Sanji wants a polyamorous relationship with Nami and Robin, which I honestly can't blame him for, both of them are pretty amazing. There's some things in this that we can confirm. When Sanji sees her, we can assume that Robin willingly went with this masked figure on her own accord. There's no doubt about that with what we are being shown here. But she's certainly not happy about this, and we can tell by how Oda draws her in this panel here, with her looking down, her eyes not being shown. Also, how Robin and the masked figure disappeared before Sanji got to them, which is very strange in and of itself, but this will make sense as we go on with the story, so we won't discuss on that fully here yet. Back with Luffy, Usopp, and Nami, they come across Iceberg, who is the mayor of Water 7 and the secretary of Caulifla. She mentions that she did some background checks on the Straw Hat crew. Most are well known, like Luffy and Zoro's bounties, and having started in the East Blue, and that there's 7 of them in total. But what is interesting again here is that she knows Robin's on board. How on earth does she possibly know this? She adds up the three's bounty, which totals up to 239 million. Obviously, Luffy's bounty at this point in time was 100 million, for Zoro it was 60 million, and for Robin it's 79. So yeah, she was definitely factoring in Robin's bounty poster. This is confusing since the general public hasn't seen her since she was a child. Hence, this is why her bounty poster hasn't been updated in over 20 years. So how could all this be possible? So when I first saw this, I really had no clue how people would know that Robin's aboard that Straw Hat ship. It was never mentioned or brought up anywhere in the story of her location. The only person that knows where she's at is Aokiji. So the fact that she knew about her whereabouts is a clue to her true identity that we'll come to find out later on in the story, because it wouldn't be possible for her to know this. However, after rewatching the series, I kinda understand how she knows about her being with the crew. We'll be getting into spoilers for future events. Later on, we find out that CP now is working undercover in Water 7, and Caulifla was one of them. And the same thing can be said as well with the masked figure finding her. So what likely happened to my knowledge is that Aokiji knew where the crew was headed as established when he saw where the crew's log post was pointing them towards. Luckily enough, at this point in time, CP9 was already at Water 7 disguised as workers for Iceberg. They've been there for the last 5 years. After his encounter with the crew, he informed the CP9 members where the Straw Hats were headed. The masked figure finds her, and when he does, he calls Caulifla about it, to let her know that he has her. None of this is ever really shown or explained, but this is my best guess on the series of events. So unlike the Long Land incident where Foxy knows that Robin's an archaeologist, and most importantly he knows that she's a part of this crew, this at least here makes more plausible sense. She knew of all this about Robin and all of the crew before an article even came out in the paper about Zoro, Luffy, and Robin being convicted of assassinating Iceberg, which those events took place after she did those background checks on them here, so we can rule that out as well. Also notice how after Caulifla mentions everyone that's a part of Luffy's crew, his attitude changes a bit, and the manga reflects that with a big single panel of his eye. And we'll see later in this arc just how he feels about her. So this attitude shift is important in that he sees her as some kind of threat or something to be taken seriously in regards to her. Which isn't really telling in this particular moment, but in hindsight, this makes a lot more sense. That's the way I took that scene at least. Iceberg brings the three into the Galley-Lock company to show them around, while Caulifla explains to them about how the company came to be. Luffy walks up to Iceberg and asks him about being a carpenter on his ship. He declines by saying that he's the mayor and can't leave, but there's other shipwrights here that might take up his offer. Iceberg then asks if there's a woman named Nico on Luffy's ship. He says that there is and that she's really smart. It's just really wholesome how much Luffy values her and calls her smart like that. I just really love it. There's just such a genuine innocence to his comment, and he says this without Robin being around, which is both really nice. Even when she isn't around, he's still honest about how he sees her and acknowledges how smart she is. While this is very typical for Luffy to be so caring for his crew, but there is just a little bit of sadness knowing about this since Robin isn't here to witness this comment being said about her. And it may actually be a bit dangerous for Luffy to admit that Robin is with them, cause who knows what kind of people it may bring to them. even though by this point Caulifla already explicitly stated that Robin was with them, but Luffy confirmed it even more so with his reply to Iceberg's question. Obviously Luffy has no idea of the greater scope and scale to just how dangerous and valuable that she is, so I can't really blame him for not understanding that. But this goes to show how carefree his attitude is, and he doesn't care about any possible risk it would be to so bluntly admit that she's with them. Back with Sanji, he appears to found Chopper off panel, and while the two are on the boat, Sanji mentions how this is bad. Chopper tells him that he's sorry to him and that he was so absorbed in the books. He says how he doesn't need to apologize, he just assumed that the person I saw with Robin was him in his human form. Chopper asks who was the masked guy. Sanji says that he hopes it's nothing, but he has a bad feeling about this. Chopper asks if he wants to examine him, but Sanji yells at him saying that he's not talking about being sick. He can't get what Aokiji said out of his head. He kept talking about Robin's past and said that we would regret having her with us someday. He tells Chopper to head back to the Mary. If everything's okay, she'll be back soon too. During their conversation, the first thing we can take notice of is how Chopper is in his walking point form, which implies that he was in that form when Sanji came across him. Naturally, this is a good sign to see Chopper using that form to gain more ground and trying to find Robin. And it makes sense for him to be in that form because he can get around the area much quicker than his usual smaller default form. Both Sanji and Chopper are pretty selfless in not blaming each other for her disappearance, which I found to be very kind and thoughtful of them to do that. They are mainly blaming themselves more than really anything else here. Both of their reasons are completely fair and understandable. Starting with Sanji, it makes sense how he just assumed that the masked figure was Chopper in his human form. In past arcs, we've seen Chopper use that form in public more often than not, so I can't really blame Sanji for assuming that. He's aware of Chopper's human form, since back in Alabasta, Sanji devised a plan where Chopper uses his human form to distract Crocodile, while Sanji goes into the rain base where the crew retract. Now obviously Sanji's plan is a bit more complicated than that, but this is just the abbreviated version of it. With Chopper's excuse, it makes the most sense for him, since he is the most childlike of the group and easily gets excited over things. So like with Sanji, I think his reasoning fits with his character too. Normally for me in stories, I always like it when characters make actions or decisions that make internal logic sense within the series. So this is why I like to point out when I come across it, because you want things to be believable to create tension. Sanji is slowly starting to piece things together that there may be something more nefarious going on with her disappearance, and I like how he's mulling over what Aokiji said. There's a part of him that is worried, but is also trying to remain hopeful and optimistic that she'll be back soon, which does show a level of trust in Robin to be on her own and be okay and not needing saving. He understands that she is capable on her own for the most part. With Sanji's bad feeling about all this, Chopper doesn't really seem to understand the gravity of the situation, at least not fully since he asked Sanji if he needed to be examined, which is a good mix of comedy because of Sanji's reaction, but it's also telling how Chopper is handling all this information. In fact, he was there when Aokiji was saying all these things about Robin to the group. So he heard what Aokiji said and didn't bother to remember it or didn't think it related to her disappearance. So Chopper is having a lack of comprehending the situation and being able to piece the puzzle together what Sanji is saying at first, since Chopper had to ask what did he say to get a clear understanding of what is bothering him. But I guess you could possibly blame Chopper for not being able to read the situation here quicker. Again, he is the youngest in the group, so I can't hold it to him too much here. Overall, this gets you in the mind of Sanji, and he does really worry about the situation, and there's no goofy romance or gags or anything. This is coming from a genuine place of worrying for a crewmate. Sanji will have more amazing and cool moments throughout this arc, and I cannot wait to get to those points and talk about it. Back with Iceberg, Caulifla informs him that they have visitors at the gate. They seem to be world government officials again. Iceberg tells Peeply to tell them that they're not there, but it's too late as the officials spotted them. Corgi tells Iceberg how they need to speak with him. He tells them that he doesn't like them and to leave. Corgi says how he has something special to tell them and to talk somewhere private. These government people and Iceberg will mean a lot more come later in the story, so it's important to mention them here. But certainly take a note on how it's established that these officials are persistent and that Iceberg doesn't like them. It appears that these officers stop by Water 7 quite often, since Peeply said previously that those people are here again, and it appears Iceberg must frequently avoid them pretty often. So we can at least infer here that Iceberg and the government are not teamed up or in alliance of any kind. Pay attention to the fact that Corgi has something special to tell him, something clearly out of the ordinary, and this at least entices Iceberg enough to hear him out on it. There's some other story elements going on here that I'll quickly go through so we know where all the characters are at, since it's important to know for what's coming up. Kaku is sent to investigate the Mary ship. When he comes back, he informs Luffy and Nami about what he saw. Polly and Kaku confirm that the ship's keel is beyond repair and can't be fixed. Not too long after getting this news, they realize Usopp was kidnapped by the Frankie pirates, who took 2 of the 3 briefcases full of money. Each briefcase contained $100 million. This money is extra important now since they will need to use that to buy a new ship. Luffy rushes to Usopp, but with no idea or direction on where he is. Polly gives Nami some idea on where their hideout is. While Nami is on her way there, she spots Usopp laying on the ground, and he tells her that they stole the money. She tells him to wait there and that they'll get the money back. After Nami leaves, Usopp goes to the hideout to demand the money back. Sanji and Chopper come back to the ship and are informed on the Mary's condition by Zoro. After the discussion on the matter, Chopper mentions again how he's worried about Robin, while Sanji says, "What an upsetting afternoon." This scene just reinstates the situation that they're in with the issues going on with them at the moment, but things will later get more complicated as this arc continues onwards, to make things go from bad to worse. Nami comes back to the ship to get Sanji, Chopper, and Zoro to help Usopp tend to his wounds. She knows their hideout so she can tell them where to go to get revenge on them. The three of them leave and Nami stays behind. Nami says that she has to hang on until Robin comes back. This is a very interesting line of dialogue and I wanted to analyze it here. It appears Sanji didn't have a chance to tell Nami about Robin's disappearance and his bad hunch of the situation. They were likely in a rush to go to Usopp after Nami explained what happened. So Nami at this point in time knows that Robin is gone and just assumes that she's still out shopping or doing something else in her own free time. Like we've seen before with Robin back in Jaya. She probably assumed Chopper stayed on the ship the whole time. She didn't know Chopper went with her earlier. She wouldn't have known all this because herself, Usopp, and Luffy went to go to Water 7 before Robin and Chopper did. I do really like how Nami sees Robin as someone for protection since she's hoping that she'll be back soon. And she was afraid to be on the ship alone. It's just really nice to see that from her overall. After they beat the Frankie pirates, Sanji and Zoro discuss on what to do next about Frankie and the money. But Sanji cuts his conversation to Zoro short, and is the first to want to go back to the ship since Nami's waiting for them, and then there's Robin too, and the problem with the ship. He certainly seems to be more urgent or impatient on just waiting around at the Frankie house, when there's all these other things going on. But we are starting to slowly see him get more and more uneasy of this situation. We cut back to the city of Water 7, specifically the Galila headquarters. Corgi ends his talk with Iceberg, and he fails to get what he was sent out to get from him. He complains how stubborn he is. Caulifla enters Iceberg's room and asks why do they come all the time. He says that Corgi wants something that he has. He comes to him with all kinds of conditions. She asks if it's something valuable. He says how he tells him that he knows nothing about such a thing and chases him away. And the last panel we see of their conversation is of Robin's bounty poster. Nothing is said outright here, but in hindsight this will all make sense. But seeing this for the first time, we immediately know that somehow, some way, Iceberg and Robin are connected or related to this thing that the government want. We don't really know at this time what that is, but we will know eventually. And it is important to mention this since Robin and Iceberg will come into contact later in the story. Back at the Mary, we see that's later on in the day. In this particular panel, the anime depicts all this as being sunset. So that's how I'm going to perceive this particular time of day. And Sanji mentions again how Robin hasn't returned. This just shows once more that he seems to be the most concerned with her out of everyone here, and none of them really ever seem to be worried that she's not back yet, and presumably many hours have passed since they last saw her. Because at least up to this point in the story, this is definitely the longest period of time that she's been away from the crew since she's been a part of it. And this is before all the craziness happening with Usopp leaving and everything going on with that, so you can't use that excuse here in this particular moment. The other point I should bring up too is this is right after everyone heard that Usopp is awake and he's okay from his injuries, so maybe that deterred the crew's initial thoughts or anything about Robin, and they were just more focused and worried about Usopp, which in this case it would make a lot more sense since Robin is a capable person that's been used to being on her own, and they assume that she'll just be gone for however long. And that's not nearly as big of a concern as to someone else like Usopp, who is definitely much more weaker and potentially a lot more vulnerable in comparison to Robin, would be more of a worry, so I could see both sides. And this once more continues that notion that Sanji is the first person to get the feeling that something is up and most certainly wrong about all of this, which was previously established back when he was talking to Chopper about all this earlier. So overall, I don't really have a whole lot to say about all this, but it is good that Sanji brought this up and to reestablish all these other previous points that I mentioned earlier. Things go from bad to worse as Luffy and Usopp have an argument on what to do with the ship. This ultimately leads Usopp leaving the crew, and he demands to fight with them at 10 o'clock for the fate of the Mary ship. If he wins, he's taking the merry-go. I don't want to get into too much details and specifics since this isn't the point of the series, but it's important to get this context for what happens. Because of all this turmoil, this leads Chopper to come back to the ship, and Zoro states that he thought he went after Usopp. Chopper responds by saying he wanted to treat his wounds, but he brushed them off. He's staying at an inn in town. Chopper recites what Usopp said to him about how they're no longer shipmates and to go back to the ship. This leads Nami to say how all the great times that they had seem like a big lie now, and on top of all this, if something happens to Robin, She feels like their crew is falling apart. Nami's comments here after hearing all this with what Chopper had said when he came back really set in stone for her situation with Usopp, and with him leaving may just be a permanent thing, and even down to her statement how everything feels like a lie. This is an extremely harsh thing to think about, that literally everything is being second guessed. Since this comment isn't really anything in particular specifically and it's just an overgeneralization, this could be applied to really anything for Nami, and the time that she spent with the crew. So this means that this can apply to all the good times that Nami has had with Robin, all of their interactions. She's even thinking that's a lie too. Now obviously this is her thinking in the heat of the moment, and I don't truly believe she believes anything she's saying here, but all the stress that's going on is getting to her. Even now she seems more and more worried about Robin compared to before. This whole series of events takes place later in the day. It does appear that Nami is starting to realize that something really has happened to Robin, or at the least is much more concerned than before. After Luffy and Usopp have their fight, Usopp eventually loses. The group go and get hotel rooms for the night and Usopp remains back at the ship. Sanji goes back to the hotel, but to the rooftop of the inn, and no one is in their rooms. None of them could sleep. Chopper asks where did he go. Sanji says they stayed by the Rocky Cap all night keeping watch, just in case Robin returned. He wonders why she left and didn't say a word. He was planning on searching the town today. Whatever happens, they will make this inn their contact point. Chopper wants to come and search, to which Sanji agrees to. Sanji, just like the rest of them, stayed up all night, but did so waiting for Robin. This really goes to show the will and dedication he has to make sure that he was around, or at the very least awake, for when she would return. His mind wouldn't even let him rest until he knew that she was okay. He, among really anyone here, does appear the most worried for her next to Chopper, and this is shown once more in his efforts to continue the search for her into the next day. It's very clear when Sanji is in his goofy, gag, simp mode for women, and when he's very serious. There's a very clear difference, and in this case, it's very clear he is showing very genuine concern and worry for her. Chopper going along with him is understandable, since he does have some guilt on him for not keeping an eye on her, and he likely still blames himself for all this. It's interesting that during this conversation, a text bubble is above Luffy's head, so I like to think that Oda's trying to make a point that Luffy is at the very least aware of her disappearance, or at least hears what they're talking about. But clearly he isn't in the mood to search for her, and I would like to imagine compared to Usopp and Robin, Luffy is much more hurt about what Usopp did, since the two were really close. It could be that, or just the simple fact that Luffy just simply didn't hear Sanji and Chopper's conversation. Though I personally don't think Luffy would be that oblivious to not realizing Robin isn't back yet. I would have to imagine he is very well aware of her not being back. He's just more torn up about what happened the night before. Everything that he went through with Usopp is just eating him up on the inside, and just the manner of how Usopp left was really heartbreaking for him. Clearly more than anything else, he is just simply not in the right headspace currently. Nami comes up to tell him that there's some terrible news. The whole town is in uproar. Last night Iceberg was shot at his home and he's in a coma. Luffy is confused by the situation and understands how everybody loved and respected him in this town. He takes it upon himself to go and check it out as Nami goes to follow him. Sanji tells Zoro that they're going to go searching for Robin and asks what about himself. He says no, he's going to wait and see what happens. A rather interesting comment from Zoro here, but how he's acting will sort of make sense later on. But Zoro here I think is afraid to get too connected to the situation. To him, searching for her will make him get emotionally attached. I just think he just wants to remain as neutral as possible throughout all of this up to this point. One last theory I just wanted to suggest is that maybe Zoro wants to wait and see what happens because maybe he thinks Robin is behind the Iceberg assassination attempt. Since way back in Alabasta, he more than likely overheard Robin mention to Usopp that she's an assassin. It's possible this is what Zoro may be referring to here, and is seeing what moves she may do next. Back at the Water 7 Northern Outpost shift station where Kokoro and Chimney are at, Chimney states to Kokoro that the wind is a southern wind. Waves are getting rough too. Looks like the sea train won't be running tonight. Not in this weather. Aqua Laguna is on its way. This sets up how uncommon it will be for Robin to be on a sea train during a storm later on in the story, since this is something that isn't normally done. But obviously for her, this is a special case. Sanji and Chopper hear from sirens that this Aqua Laguna is coming. They ask a person what this is and they get informed about it. It's a high tide and it's best to evacuate someplace high up. The town will be submerged in seawater. According to the forecast, it'll hit about midnight. It's an annual thing. Sanji tells Chopper that they gotta hurry and find Robin. This makes the situation even more worse than what was going on for them previously. This will set the arc's ticking clock of trying to find her before this tide hits. Later on the arc, Sanji will go on the comments saying that if she's on board the sea train, then they are really in trouble. It's hard enough searching Water 7 without adding more islands to the mix. Therefore, if she leaves and they don't find her, it'll make finding Robin that much more difficult and near impossible to do so. So the stakes just got even more crazier with this going on, and this really sets the mood for high tension of hoping that they could find her in time. Nami and Luffy's efforts of trying to get to Iceberg is showing to be a tall task with the commotion that the city's in with Iceberg being shot. But Luffy states, and once again he's very adamant to meet Ice Guy just one more time. They ask where the office is, but a civilian says that it's impossible to get to. We have to go through Dock 1, but only authorized personnel and reporters with special permissions are allowed through. We are then presented with the introduction of Frankie, who is shown to be the Frankie family boss. Luffy and Frankie make eye contact and will engage in battle due to Frankie wanting revenge for Luffy's crew destroying his hideout. This sets up more conflict to come later in the story, so it will be important to set up these events, and this will come back and relate to Robin. That I can assure you with. And the same thing can be said in regards to Iceberg's assassination attempt. Back at the Galila, Califula tells Polly and the group that Iceberg just regained consciousness. To the group and the media's delight upon hearing this. As they enter the room, Iceberg tells them that last night that there was 2 people who entered his room. One was a large guy with a mask on, and the other was a tall, black-haired woman. Those sharp eyes. It had to be Nico Robin. This is where chapter 335 ends. This already brings a lot of mystery and confusion as to why Robin would do this. She's with the same person that crossed her path early in the arc. This leads to many questions as, was she forced to do this? And what made her decide to go through with it? She's never really been the type of person to try and outright kill people. We've seen Alabasta where she's had multiple chances to kill people, but she chose not to. Even with her first appearance of blowing up Ingram's ship, I never personally believed that she would ever do that based on all the evidence that we've seen with her up to this point. She's even made jokes about being an assassin with Usopp in a teasing manner with that little heart emoji. And the way that Iceberg confirms that I was wrong based on her sharp eyes, which can give us a good indication of how people viewed her for the last 20 years. People look at her and they just see something haunting. All this does a really great job of making the viewer want more and to see this mystery unfold and the eagerness to know why Robin would be involved with all this. It makes you wonder if she's really someone that we should like and trust. For me, I was second guessing myself on liking her upon first viewing of all this. After hearing what Iceberg said, it is pretty surprising that Robin would actually shoot him, considering she typically never has used a gun. Up to this point in the series, Robin has been shown mainly using her Devil Fruit powers. She appears to not really rely on weapons when her whole body could be used as one, so there's no need for her to use a gun. Looking at this before knowing more information is disclosed to the viewer, we can already get the feeling that something isn't right about all this. This wouldn't be something Robin would do in a normal circumstance. And this is where part 2 will conclude. I think this is a nice teaser for the next part and for things to come. I know most of this part was just really setting up events to come later in the story, but I will assure you next part will be even more meatier with the Robin content to look into, so I look forward to eventually getting to that. I will see you all in part 3. Take care.